There we go. Hello everyone, my name is Simon. I figured I'm going to introduce myself today again because not everyone might know me. I used this slide at the last Haxe, but I thought I could just do it again. So, as I said, my name is Simon. I have been a Haxe user since 2010, so that's 10 years now actually. Yeah. And it started when I was working as a student on a thesis which involved a fluid simulation and the Flash player. For some reason my professor thought it would be a good idea. I actually wanted to just work on a game at the time, so I wanted to make a game in, well, ActionScript, so I guess you can relate. And my professor was like, well, maybe you should add a fluid simulation. And I thought, okay, let's do that. And I found a nice paper and started implementing that. And the problem was that this fluid simulation, well, you had to do a lot of array access operations per cell, per step. And you had you could choose how many cells you would have, but generally like 256 by 256, so that's a lot of cells. And that by 100 is a lot of array access operations. And it turned out that doing that in ActionScript with the on a normal array just wasn't fast whatsoever. The original paper was written in C, so it had C array access, which is really fast, it's just an offset. But in ActionScript 3, that was not the case. And I tried using Flash vector, and it was promised to be, well, faster than array, and I think it is in some instances, but it definitely wasn't fast enough for my use case. And I somehow came across this blog post from Nicola where he talks about some secret alchemy opcodes, which sounds really cool. But at the time, Adobe had this alchemy thing, and it turned out in the Flash player were some opcodes which were not usable from ActionScript 3, actually. They were just there. And Nicola, working on Haxe, figured, well, we can just target these opcodes and use them. And these opcodes... We have a sound problem, apparently. Am I speaking too loudly? Or do you have me muted or something?
No, fine.
Yeah, it would be good to get some...
It says sound question mark.
Okay, so maybe nobody can hear me, actually.
Oh, okay. That message is old. All right.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Okay, no problem. So, as I was saying, there were these secret alchemy opcodes, and Haxe was using them, and I learned by porting this fluid simulation to Haxe that it was actually up to the task, and implemented a fluid simulation that was running through on the Flash player in the browser, and that was actually really impressive at the time. And I appreciated Haxe for that, and somehow I slowly became a contributor to Haxe with some small things in the beginning, and I kind of had a steep career because in 2012 I then became the main maintainer of the Haxe compiler. Because at the time Nicola wanted to focus on his games company, Gyro Games. Was it already Gyro Games at the time? It was still Motion Twin at the time, right? Yeah. And he wanted to focus on making games like I originally was. And so
you realized that you didn't want to focus.
Yeah, and he kind of wanted to not really work on Haxe itself anymore in the same capacity as he used to. So he was looking for someone to take that over, basically, and I was at the right place at the right time. And we also in 2012 then founded the Haxe Foundation, so I'm a founding member of that. And I'm going to talk about the Haxe Foundation a bit more later, but that's basically how I got here. And now I want to give a very brief overview about what we did last year. We started out making some release candidates for the 4.0.0 release, and then recruited some people. It was Orwell Bailey for a 6-month internship, and also Alexander, who has been with us since April, so you're going to have your anniversary soon in April. So we're now 2 developers instead of 1, which is a big increase.
100% improvement.
Then in May we had the US Haxe Summit in Seattle. We made another release candidate and followed by some more release candidates, and then in October it was finally time, the big reveal. We actually released 4.0.0. After several years in development, it finally happened. And then over the course until the end of the year we had several Dodge releases 4.0.1 to 4.0.5, and 4.0.5 is the current release that we have. You might notice that there's one missing. I don't know why that happened, but yes. So that's the past, so let's think about the future. Our plans for 2020. This is kind of very rough. We saw just like the great timeline, the release plans that Ingo Games have for their things, and ours are a bit more lenient and sometimes more, how should I say this? Yeah, we don't really plan ahead that much in general. But I'm trying to do this now, so we want to have our 4.1 release sometime in the first half of this year. And it's going to include, we already implemented tail recursion elimination, which basically means that if you have recursive calls to a function at the end of the function, we might eliminate that call and instead have a loop in that function, so you don't have a real call, you just loop back to the beginning of the function, which is good for several reasons. And we also just merged SSL support for eval, which is our macro interpreter. So Haxe can now be used to make HTTPS requests and probably some other use cases that we haven't figured out yet. Also, Alex is currently working on cross-target exception handling. Basically, we want to add a Haxe exception class, which should then be used as a base class for exceptions, because Haxe allows you to throw any exceptions that you want, which is generally, it sounds pretty useful. If you just prototype something, it's okay, just throw some string. But in actual code bases, it turns out that, well, you may want to catch a specific exception, so you should probably structure your exceptions properly. And that's why we try to make that a bit nicer overall. And then one thing we've been focused on a lot are IDE improvements, because I know, and that has come up through Ingo Games, that there are, in big code bases, IDE support can be a bit tricky at times. Sometimes things just don't work, or things work but work way too slowly. So we want to put a big focus on that and really make it so that the IDE experience in Haxe is comparable to that of other languages. And I'm going to mention that again a bit later. So that's going to be 4.1 probably, and then a bit later 4.2, where we are working on an asynchronous system library. At the moment, our library for file access and everything, it's all synchronous, which comes with some issues, and hopefully we'll get this figured out. So we'll have something that's more similar to the Node.js library. And we're also working on coroutines. That has been around for quite a while. We've been designing back and forth, and many people have many ideas, and we're still not quite sure where we're going, but I think we're getting to a point where there's a consensus on what we want to do. And once we reach a consensus, it should be possible to implement that relatively quickly and then have that in the 4.2 release. And also something Nadako has been working on for like 10 years is module level functions, which will basically mean that you can, in your HX file, you don't have to declare a class, you can immediately just put a function without having to wrap that in a class. And maybe we'll finish that at some point, actually, would be nice, because I can imagine it's quite useful. And what we are also going to do, so mark that in your calendar, in October, we're going to have the EU Haxe Summit in Linz in Germany. So we can all meet again there. And I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, it's going to become the Haxe capital of the world, exactly. So, yeah. So I hope that we are going to see many of you there again. It's still some month off, so you have time to plan. And now I want to briefly talk about the Haxe Foundation, because we always talk about Haxe and the language and all the cool features, and that's always quite easy to talk about, but we never really talk about what the Haxe Foundation itself actually is and does. And if you look on our website, you see there's this quote: "After years of open source development, the Haxe Foundation was created to fund long-term Haxe development and provide support to companies using Haxe." And that's basically it. we want to reach out to companies who want to use Haxe and offer them, well, our support in the end. Because ultimately, these companies, like Ingo Games for instance, pay for support, which means they give us money, and I'm going to mention what they get for that money. But first of all, I want to talk about what we actually use that money for. For instance, as I've already mentioned, we're paying our developers, which is currently Alexander and me. And that's really nice because as much as I love Haxe and love working on Haxe, I also have to pay my rent. So money is unfortunately necessary in our world, so we need this kind of contribution in order to support this and support us and thus support Haxe. We also fund individual projects. At the moment, there's one by George Congy who's working on a DTS to Haxe script converter, Haxe converter, which is DTS is the TypeScript external definition format. So I worked on that a while ago, but I really only started working on that because I had just written a parser generator and I wanted to have a use case for my parser generator. So I figured, well, let's write a parser for TypeScript external definitions. And I did that and then figured, okay, now that I can parse these, we can probably generate Haxe from that. And it worked out okay. The problem was that TypeScript kind of evolved and parsing it became difficult. And then the idea was, well, instead of going through all the trouble and parsing TypeScript in Haxe, it would be much better if we just hooked into the TypeScript compiler directly and get it to output Haxe externs. And that's what George is working on. He has a prototype right now, which is written in TypeScript still. And he tells me like around March, it may be ready for people to test. And I hope that's true. And this has been something that has come up for quite a while now. And I hope that we finally get it done, because there are a lot of TypeScript external definitions of varying quality, which should make it easier to interop with Haxe from JavaScript. And finally, what we also do with the money is we organize events, as for instance the EU Summit that I just mentioned in Linz, and Josephine will talk about that a bit after my talk. And that's our point of view. And then as a Haxe Foundation partner, what does a Haxe Foundation partner actually get? And of course, you get priority bug fixes and improvements. It was mentioned already that there were some issue reports, and if you're a foundation partner, we basically guarantee that we look into these very quickly. And we generally do, I think. Sometimes, of course, it takes a bit longer depending on the issue, but we want to make our partners happy, as we generally do. And yeah. What partners also can do is influence the strategic direction of Haxe. So partners can give input of what we want to do. Usually at the Haxe summits, we have these meetings where we sit in a room and talk about what is the things we should focus on at the moment and where should we put our resources, and everyone gets to input their ideas. And then we usually come to some conclusions on where we're going with Haxe. However, you cannot exactly buy a Haxe feature, even as a Haxe Foundation partner, even at the highest level. You can't just come in and say, we want this specific Haxe feature. And I mentioned that because we actually had a case like that, where one of our former partners wanted a specific feature which TypeScript had. And they figured, yeah, we definitely need that in Haxe, but from our point of view, that wouldn't really fit Haxe. So, whoa.
You don't have to cry about that. It's fine.
Something my and yeah, I just want to make that clear. What we do instead is our partners outline the problem that they want to solve, because usually you don't want a specific feature, you actually want to solve a specific problem, and then we work with our partners on solving that problem. And the communication with our partners, we usually do that to what I just called the ambassadors to the Haxe Foundation. In your case, that's mostly Dan, who has been with us in the Haxe Foundation Slack for years now, since before he joined you. So
He's even on the website, isn't he?
Hmm?
He's on the website as
Yeah.
well. He's like an official person.
So I like to view these people as kind of the ambassadors, because they get the information from you and bring it to us, and then we communicate that way. And I want to give an example of something, just a kind of minor feature, but I just want to show how we did that for this feature, which is the go to implementations feature. If in your IDE, if you have an interface and you want to know which classes implement that interface, IDEs generally allow you to go to all, in VS Code it's called the implementations. And this is something that we didn't have yet. So Dan approached us and said, well, in our code base we have a lot of interfaces and we have a lot of subclasses and overrides and all these kind of things, so this feature would be useful for us. And we simply didn't have it because I guess it never came up, and I think VS Code only started supporting it quite somewhat recently, right? I don't really remember, but it's somewhat new, I think. So the issue was raised and we had an internal discussion about it. And then the issue was addressed. In this case, it took like, well, it was a bit less than a month, but considering there was Christmas in between and New Year and that kind of stuff, and we actually had to discuss a bit on how we want to do that, I think that's still a good turnaround. And it's now available in the current Haxe Nightly and VS Haxe 2.18, which I think is the current release. And this kind of thing, what I want to highlight here is that it's good for everyone involved, because obviously the people with the code base, InnoGames, get this feature, which helps you guys. It helps Haxe, because it's not just you people who get this feature, everyone can use it now. So it's good for everyone. And finally, I can also say, well, thank you guys for funding this feature. So it's also good for InnoGames in the sense that we can now say they supported us in making features like that. And of course, in the grand scheme of things, it's a very minor thing, but we have several of these minor things, and it's important for companies to tell us what they need for their work. And through that workflow, I think we're making great improvements to Haxe, and I hope that this is going to continue. So thank you, InnoGames, for your support. I hope we'll be able to support you for a long time. And with that, my talk is also concluded. So thank you for your attention. And are there any questions? Yes, please.
What happened to the Haxe Game Jam idea?
Yura asked what happened to the Haxe Game Jam idea. I don't remember.
Oh yeah.
The idea was to have a game jam.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that. We talked at some point about having a Haxe Game Jam and hosting it on some platform. To be honest, I think there was just nobody who came forward and was like, okay, I'm going to organize it.
That's a good
Sorry?
segue for me, actually.
Okay.
Okay, I guess with that, it's a good segue for her, so I'm just going to.
This is like
Okay.